The history of the land and people of Pakistan begins with the Indus Valley civilization.
History repeats itself. Do you see those patterns emerging over and over again?
Political competition basically selects the worst people, puts them in the worst type of competition, and ends up selecting the worst of them to then rule over everybody else.
We also look for those messiah, the leaders who single-handedly would change the system. So we would bet on them rather than trying to fix the institutions.
When you take a good person and you put them in a bad structure, in an arbitrary situation, it is only a matter of time before that experience corrodes whatever moral or psychological inhibitions they may have had.
Could there be any particular reform that can change the direction of where we are heading to?
What Pakistan cannot survive is...
Dr. Ilhan Niaz, you've spent much of your life studying empires, states, and cultures of power. You're author of 6 books.
Ji.
What are you ultimately trying to understand through history?
Well, what I'm trying to explain is why states form in the first place, how they form, and how they behave once they are formed, and how the path dependencies that are created during the early phase of a state's formation effectively carry on through later stages. So that produces a culture of power, a culture of doing business in the government. And even when you have many formal changes taking place with the passage of time, even when you have a change of, let's say, regime taking place, the same patterns of behavior reassert themselves, sometimes taking slightly new forms or taking slightly new names. So what I'm interested in is that why is the way that we exercise power so persistent, so sticky in a sense, that it is something which is nearly impossible to modify in a beneficent or in a positive manner. And it is very easy to let it decay, to let it deteriorate, and to then experience a kind of unenlightened, selfish, arbitrary exercise of power with which we are all too familiar in our own region. So that is the thing which I'm looking at. And what I'm doing is that I've been looking at it from the perspective of South Asia as the center. So when you typically look at theories about development or political order or political science or other such things, they emerge from the experience of a handful of Western countries. And those handful of Western countries are actually very different from the rest of the world. So one of my main contentions is that if you are actually going to come up with good theories that explain the world in an effective way, you actually need to use societies that are closer to the median or the average of other human societies, rather than looking at some societies that are very different from most others, and then examining them from the precise point at which they begin to modernize, and then effectively universalizing their modernization experience and saying that, well, the rest of the world has to somehow conform to those ideas. So what I'm trying to, in effect, do is to develop a South Asia-centered theory, a South Asia-centered understanding of how and why states behave the way that they do.
When was the time when you realized that you were interested in studying history and you wanted to pursue a career in this?
Well, I've always been interested in history. It's always been my favorite subject. Growing up, it was my favorite subject. I was the annoying kid in school who knows ridiculously large amounts of information about why the First World War happened.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I was often sought after on quiz groups and trivia teams and stuff like that. But very specifically, I think this was in 1994. I read A History of the World by J.M. Roberts.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I actually read what you would consider a serious history book. And I just found it so fascinating and so terrifying as well, given all the horrific things people have been doing to each other from the dawn of time. And it also showed how the story of people is, in some respects, unique to every individual group of people, but how it is also very similar across different cultures and geographies and places and types of states and other such things. So that actually made me more interested in the academic sense. And then I just started reading because history is a great subject that way. You don't actually need any formal instruction in it because you can simply read it and understand it and draw meaningful conclusions from whatever it is that you have read. So that sort of led me down that rabbit hole. And I ended up through, I would say, very good fortune at the Quaid-e-Azam University, where we had an astounding number of extraordinary historians from whom we learned. And I then started doing what I enjoy the most for also earning a livelihood. So, in that sense, I ended up being doubly fortunate.
It's a matter of luck actually कि you end up in a profession where you actually don't feel its work and you enjoy doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, like Pakistan is full of extremely unhappy doctors and engineers and accountants. And this is a conversation which I have often had with parents that they basically think that if the kid is not learning a highly technical discipline, like one of these three, four highly technical disciplines, they are essentially a failure. And so this is something which we also deal with a lot in the social sciences, arts, and humanities, that very often you have a lot of really brilliant kids, but the way that society treats these subjects, and in many cases, the way their own homes treat these subjects, completely crush their confidence and sense of self-worth. So that's also, very unfortunate, because one of the things that you learn from history is that before a society can experience meaningful material improvement and technical improvement, it has to change its culture and its worldview in order to embrace the kind of thinking that makes those changes possible in the first place. So this has been a long-standing, I think, problem for a lot of developing countries. Pakistan is no exception in this regard. That you have to study something highly technical, and I'm very fortunate that my parents were not like that at all. So my sister is a poet and I'm a historian, so we are like very untypical in that sense. But I was very lucky also that I had that parental support as well.
And as a kid, would it like sometimes annoy you when you had these discussions about history? Just now, for example, a lot of people, I don't know, maybe the curriculum is to blame, but मुझे लगता है कि a lot of people do not have that clear history of, as to कि when the world started prehistory, तो चलो ठीक है वो, that is a separate debate, but even the civilizations, and maybe like in a lot of people in my circle growing up, I felt that there was lack of understanding ke how old the earth is, for example. बहुत सारे लोगों से अभी भी आप पूछे ना कि लाइक क्या लगता है कि दुनिया कितनी पुरानी है, तो वो कुछ लोग तो दे वुड कोट द फिगर 2026 फॉर एग्जांपल, या वो उनको होगा कि अच्छा मे बी इफ द पिरामिड्स आर लाइक 5000 ईयर्स ओल्ड, या डायनासोर का टाइम है, तो बस वो थोड़ा सा वेग एक वो फिगर उनके जेन में आएगा. बट आई थिंक वी डू नॉट हैव दैट डेप्थ अबाउट द हिस्ट्री. तो एज अ किड, would it annoy you sometimes?
Not really, no. I mean, people, one of the great things about being a historian is that very few people take the subject all that seriously. So you can just enjoy learning about it and not be too worried, because people would typically not think at all about it. And if they do think about it, then you're right, they might have some fuzzy ideas about where things belong in the past. Like you mentioned, probably they'll know a little bit about the pyramids. Maybe they've heard of, Napoleon or something like that, a couple of these figures. But for a lot of people, history is just politics. It's just the, let's say, biography of a few great individuals, scattered across time. There is no attempt to, interrogate how the greater forces that have shaped human history are actually shaping what you are experiencing right now. So I would argue that, in a sense, most people uh, don't have that much historical consciousness. The little consciousness they do have, maybe they got from some very faulty textbook that had its own agenda on its mind, and they haven't really bothered too much to interrogate, what's going on. Of course, maybe they've watched Ancient Aliens documentaries and are convinced of some like really wild theories about how history has unfolded. And you must have seen that meme that there's these like ancient Egyptians building the pyramids, and they're like, wow, this is such hard work. At least people will remember us forever. And then there's a picture of modern tourists saying that, oh, look, aliens built those. So what was the point of all those hardworking ancient Egyptians? So yes, so there is that element. And another big problem that, of course, we have is that a lot of people also get what they know about history from movies. And while movies are, of course, a very good entertainment medium, there are very few movies that are, in any sense of the term, historically accurate. And people who watch those movies maybe then get a sense of the past, which is based upon a creative reimagining, which at some level might be authentic, but very often is not really accurate. So that's also something which is quite popular in a sense when it comes to engaging with history as a subject.
And as somebody who has read history throughout your career, and do you agree with the statement that history repeats itself? Do you see those patterns emerging over and over again?
I think when you look at the philosophy of history, and we start with, let's say, Herodotus. So Herodotus lives about 2,500 years ago, and he is from Halikarnassus in what is now Turkey, then ancient Greek Ionia. And his family flees to what is now Greece proper. And after the Great War between the Greeks and the Persians, he goes about and he writes a history of that period. And his history is very profoundly influenced by philosophy. And the philosophy in particular that he is impressed by is the political philosophy of Solon of Athens, a statesman that lived roughly 570, 590 BC, who gave Athens its first constitution. And Solon essentially argued that there is a paradox, there is a contradiction in politics and in power. In every other discipline, competition produces a more proficient winner. So if you think about any profession, whether it's engineering or medicine, etc., if you're a good engineer or a good doctor, you heal your patients, you build good infrastructure, build good houses, do whatever good work, you acquire a reputation. And conversely, if your patients are, dying at your hands, or if you're building houses that collapse when the first rain comes by or whatever, you will acquire a negative reputation and people will penalize you for that. So what Solon said was that, the problem is that when it comes to political competition basically rewards the most ruthless, the most heartless, and the most selfish and stubborn element in that competition. But ruthlessness, heartlessness, stubbornness are precisely the qualities you don't need in order to be good at government. So political competition basically selects the worst people, puts them in the worst type of competition, and ends up selecting the worst of them to then rule over everybody else. So over time, political competition leads to a sort of reverse Darwinian effect when it comes to the actual governance of a state or the governance of a society. And the reason for that is that our human nature is basically not equipped to handle the effects of power on its mentality. So, whenever a society becomes very strong or powerful, whenever an individual becomes very strong or wealthy or powerful, that individual, in a sense, loses touch with reality and then proceeds towards a downfall. So, that underlying theory is what Herodotus uses in order to explain the rise and fall of different states that he encounters along the way, the decisions made by different empires and leaders that ended up in creating a disastrous conflict that ultimately ended in a bloody stalemate for all sides. So, Herodotus, in a sense, tries to explain to us why we are so bad at exercising power. And why is it that whenever we acquire power and success, our conceit, our pride before the fall, our hubris takes over. And that inevitably leads us to nemesis and collapse, whether at the individual level or at the collective level. So that is something which has been very, very close to history. So as Ibn Khaldun tells us in the Muqaddimah, you can't really understand history without the aid of philosophy. So history is not just an account of wars and kings and one, inanity after another. There's that as well. That's narrative history. But the purpose of history is to tell you why the world has evolved the way that it has. And that is fundamentally a philosophical question. And when you pose that philosophical question, you clearly see that yes, there are patterns, that yes, there is repetition, that yes, there are broad continuities across time and space. But at the same time, there is change as well. So the important thing is to understand what changes and to also understand what remains the same. And that is something which I would argue any good historian would also try to explain to their readers, whatever period or whatever subject they are particularly picking on as far as their book or their research paper or monograph is concerned.
Just to understand Pakistan's history better, and I think there are many caveats, I would say, like in the history that probably that we study in school, or the history of the narrative that is predominant, and rightly so. There are like probably reasons behind that, that why it is the way it is. But I have this 7 moments from the history of this land, the Pakistani state, and I want you to help us understand which ones define us and which ones we have misunderstood.
Sure.
So here, just pass it on. So Indus Valley Civilization, Muhammad bin Qasim, Mughal Empire, 1857, Lahore Resolution.
And the separation of East Pakistan. You stopped at 1971. I mean, you could have added points after that as well. But, so basically Pakistan.
So again, I think like I would reframe that. For you, आपके ख्याल से पाकिस्तान की जो हिस्ट्री है फंडामेंटली वो कहाँ से स्टार्ट होती है, regardless of what we are taught in the books?
The history of the land and people of Pakistan begins with the Indus Valley civilization. The history, of course, of the state of Pakistan, as you and I are familiar with, begins, I would basically argue, with the Lahore Resolution, and then, of course, after 1947. You can stretch that a little bit. So if you go into the 19th century, early 20th century, you do have the development of Muslim separatism and Muslim nationalism and that kind of consciousness. But fundamentally, if you're talking about Pakistan as a state, so we are a relatively young state in the sense that as an idea, as a political movement, to achieve an idea, Pakistan comes into existence via the Lahore Resolution. And as an actual state, it of course comes into existence in August 1947. But as a people, as a society, as a culture, as a broader continuity of historical experience, for that you go back to all the way to when we know the first complex civilizations arose in this land of ours.
I have some of your books with me here, and it's like really interesting depth that you have added and the details. But one of the things that fascinated me here, probably in this book, the culture of power and governance of Pakistan. And here you mentioned about, that how the rulers in, starting from the Indus civilizations, they
The Arthashastra bhi bol sakte hain. Yeah.
so the Arthashastra bureaucratic machine was supposed to work 18 hours a day. So the rulers, they were like, swamped with so much work in order to run the machinery. And then the second thing was like the breakdown of the kind of salaries that they were getting. So these kind of details, I'm sure, like these are forgotten to us Pakistanis. Why do you think that it is important for us to study this, particularly Indus Valley civilization, a little more carefully, and how it shapes the national identity that we have?
Okay, so when it comes to the Indus Valley civilization, most of our information about it comes from archaeological studies. The Arthashastra is primarily about the Mauryan Empire, roughly 320 BC to 180 BC. And that is the first major South Asian empire about which we have detailed historical information, detailed records in the form of inscriptions, in the form of surviving texts, reports, other such things. And the Arthashastra is a kind of compendium of the accumulated wisdom in relation to the state and the political economy that ancient India or early South Asia possessed. So I think it's very important to learn about these things, because when you learn about these things, you quickly realize that a lot of our problems are, in fact, not problems that originate during the colonial period. So when you talk about, let's say, the rule by unaccountable bureaucrats, or when you talk about military rule, or when you talk about the tendency of our political leaders to act as if the state is their personal estate, all of these things start from literally the earliest known period in our history. And as a consequence, if we are going to seriously address those problems, we need to stop making the lazy argument that, well, this is all colonial. Well, fair enough. The British did a lot of very bad things, and we can talk about those. But when it comes to our behavior in relation to the state, that is very, very much rooted in the thousands of years of experience prior to colonial rule. And in fact, the colonial state in India or in South Asia effectively modernized in its own way the various institutions and practices it inherited from the Mughal Empire and its successor states. And of course, created a new ruling class that was brought in from England to occupy key positions. But the practices and the way in which the state was governed owed a lot to what had happened before. So I think this is something which is very important for us as not just Pakistanis, but also generally speaking South Asians, whether you're from India or from Pakistan, need to start wrapping our head around. So I think that is one very important lesson that we can take away from it.
And talking about these particular events here on the paper, what do you think that which one of these are more neglected, exaggerated, or misunderstood? Let's start with Indus civilization.
Okay, so when it comes to the Indus Valley civilization, there is a huge amount of scope for using that civilization in order to show Pakistan's ancient heritage. And when you think about the Indus Valley civilization, it's one of the Bronze Age River Valley civilizations. So, what is now Pakistan is not simply a civilization, it is one of the cradles of civilization. And that is something which I would argue any sensible Pakistani government or sensible Pakistani ruling elite would have really tried to embrace and cash in order to show that Pakistan is not simply something that was dreamed up in 1940 and achieved in 1947, though modern Pakistan is, but Pakistan draws upon a legacy of hundreds or thousands of years of civilization and identity and culture and social society. And we have to learn from it and embrace it wherever we feel comfortable, and also project it to the rest of the world. The way, let's say, the Egyptians project their pyramids, for instance, you know. So I think this is something which we really need to learn a lot from. And of course, there is a tremendous scope of research as well, because the language is as yet undeciphered. But there is just so much that we can learn, even just drawing upon the archaeological information.
And there is a shifting narrative probably now that we are, highlighting this part of our identity of Indus Valley civilization, probably because of its political significance these days, because of this Indus Water Treaty dispute with India. But what do you think? What was the reason why this part of our national identity was downplayed to that extent? Was it to distinguish ourselves from the Indians?
Uh, well, I'm not sure it was downplayed straight away. So, I mean, you can Google this and check the exact dates. But a few years after Pakistan came into existence, I believe Mortimer Wheeler published a book about the Indus Valley called 5,000 Years of Pakistan. And I think if you go to, let's say, the first 2, 3 decades of Pakistan's independence, there was no real hostility towards the pre Islamic past, if you will. That seems to have seeped in during the 1980s, particularly as a result of Zia's Islamization. And the hangover of that continues partly into our own time. But one is hopeful that Pakistani society and generally speaking, people in Pakistan are now starting to come out of that kind of thinking and are increasingly comfortable with their Islamic heritage and their pre-Islamic heritage.
And like the subsequent events that are mentioned here, any of these where you think like is probably a bit too exaggerated than it should be in our history?
Well, I think maybe we make a little bit too much out of the Arab conquest of Sindh, and we probably make a little bit too little about the Mughal Empire. So, this is right now the 500th anniversary of the founding of the Mughal Empire. And you really don't see any great effort by anybody really in Pakistan to cash in on that, even though Lahore, especially, is very rich in terms of its Mughal heritage. So I think there are, in a way, spaces where Pakistanis have sort of conceded to maybe India when it comes to owning certain past regimes. And the fact is, of course, that the Mughal Empire had a very major role in shaping this particular region that we are in. It was one of the most important regions for that empire for both reasons of economy and security. And there is a lot that we can learn about that period. So yes, I mean, I think we maybe overemphasize the Arab conquest and we underemphasize or neglect the Mughal heritage.
Talking about the Zia's era particularly, and you also highlighted that we could go on probably after 1971, things that shaped or the events that shaped Pakistan's national identity. How significant that period was, and where do you see, like, does it have more impact in our society today than the rest of these events?
If you look at the statistics, I think they will tell you that the median age of Pakistanis is less than 23 years old. Maybe it's closer to 22, 22 and a half or thereabouts. What that means is that for a majority of Pakistanis, even General Musharraf's regime is something that they would vaguely remember from their early childhood. And the Zia regime is, let's say, as close to them as the World War II would have been to my generation. It's something that happened in the past, 40 years ago, 45 years ago. And maybe they think Zia was a bad man or a good man, depending upon what they've been told about him. But it's very remote in that sense. And the legacy of that period is something which Pakistanis live with and which, whenever you try to answer any question, so for example, we keep hearing that, well, Pakistan has been going to the IMF, 2 dozen times. But when you look at the record, what you basically see is that it was really in the 1980s that Pakistan entered the structural adjustment program and basically never ever left it. When you look at many of Pakistan's problems in terms of its internal security, in terms of radicalization, in terms of the proliferation of small arms and drugs, all of those tie into the Zia regime. When you look at the terrible difficulty Pakistan has had in terms of giving its religious minorities and its women their due share of the nation's progress and prosperity, again, it harks back to the policies of that period. So whenever Pakistanis are confronted with the reality of a very, very dysfunctional state, a very dysfunctional economy, the proximate origins of that lie during the Zia regime. Though you might argue some of those things actually started during the Bhutto government, but they really intensified and acquired a life of their own during the Zia period. So I think in that respect, Zia's time in power, those 11 years or so that he ruled, are a very, very dangerous and a very, very harsh period for Pakistan, not only in terms of what he did during his time in power, but in terms of the legacy that he left behind. So I think that in a way, Pakistan's political leaders, including subsequent military leaders like General Musharraf, have tried to move Pakistan away from that very dark legacy. But it is a very, very powerful legacy because Zia basically brought out the worst in us. And he empowered the worst in us to effectively run crazy and do whatever they felt like. And bringing society back to some kind of reasonable, decent equilibrium is really something which has proven incredibly difficult for his successors. Even when they have wanted to do it, the sheer power of the chaos that he unleashed has been very hard to actually tackle in any meaningful way.
And do you think, like, we are still tackling science or the the culture that he had set even today, and still trying to sort of like get rid of them? Is there any effort, do you think, in the system that goes into?
I think one of the things which you, let's say, see in Pakistan, especially if, let's say, you have any direct experience of the Zia period and then Pakistan since General Musharraf's regime, you will definitely see that society has opened up. You will definitely see that people enjoy uh, a lot more in terms of their options of just living their daily life as they want to. You will also see that there is some level of pushback from the state and also from society against the worst excesses of that period. But there are plenty of people who are actually very happy with that legacy as well. And the way that that legacy empowered them has made them extremely difficult for anybody to deal with.
Your book suggests that independence may change who controls the state without necessarily changing how power works. So, what survives after an empire ends? And in Pakistan's case, and like particularly Zia's case, how would you see that?
I would basically see post 47 through a couple of indicators. The first is that the rhetoric of the Pakistani ruling elite after independence became very similar to the rhetoric of other newly independent countries and also modern Western countries or industrialized states. And that is, the avowed objective became to turn Pakistan into an industrialized welfare state. So that has been the stated goal of every Pakistani government since 1947. And that has also been the stated goal of every Indian government, and I suppose nearly every other government of
Whoever
every
gets
other.
the independence, they want
They
like
say that,
radical changes.
exactly, our
Yeah.
goal is to create an industrialized welfare state and become a culturally different but socially and economically Western or modernized society. So that has been the goal. And what you also see in the context of Pakistan and also India is that having made these very lavish promises, having made these very grand claims about what they want to achieve, the ruling elite fails to deliver. It tries to deliver in some level. So you do see some progress taking place. It is still much better than the colonial Raj in terms of developing economic growth and development. But compared to other post-colonial states, other newly independent countries, other countries emerging from the wreckage of the European age of empires, the Pakistani elite starts to fall further and further behind. And you see this very dramatically, for example, if we look at what happens if you compare South Asia to China. So China had a horrific 19th century and early 20th century. They were invaded, their country fell into warlordism, there were recurring bouts of civil war, you had multiple invasions, the Russians in the north, eventually the Japanese got in on the action as well. Massive chaos, disturbance, upheaval, horrific 100 years or so of Chinese history. India, during that same period, was under British rule. So there was underdevelopment enforced by the interests of the colonial state, but generally speaking, there was internal peace. And in 1950, when China is unified, if you compared the GDP per capita figures, then India and Pakistan are about 20% richer on average than China is. When you look at 1980, China is about equal. When you look at 2000, it's about 2 to 1 in relation to India and 3 to 1 in relation to Pakistan. And today, it is something like 5 to 1 or 6 to 1 in relation to India, and maybe 12 to 1 in relation to Pakistan. So, the thing to always understand is that whenever you are in a particular period of time, while the earlier regime does set a benchmark, your competition is basically against other contemporary states and societies. So even if you have performed better than the colonial Raj did, and both the Indians and the Pakistani states have actually performed a lot better than the colonial Raj ever did, your competition is not with that colonial Raj. Your competition is with the newly independent countries that have emerged around the same time as you have emerged from colonial rule. And there, what you see is a very, very poor performance compared to other countries that actually had it worse during the colonial period and gained independence with far fewer resources and far fewer assets than the South Asian states did. So that actually poses a very interesting problem in a sense, that why is it that states that experienced worse forms of colonial rule than we did ended up doing better, whereas we ended up falling further and further behind many countries that were actually considerably behind us or equal to us when we became independent. And I think that is where the culture of power comes in. Because one of the things that we learn from, let's say, when we study ancient China or generally speaking Confucian societies, is that they have an ancient tradition, an indigenous tradition of meritocracy. Indeed, the very idea of meritocracy and the practice of meritocracy is something that was invented and institutionalized first in ancient China. In our part of the world, we do not have that same indigenous tradition. So our experience of meritocracy is actually very closely affected by the British colonial state and its methods of recruiting through public exams and its system that it introduced to recruit the military and the civil service and other such things, which India and Pakistan continued and expanded also after independence. But our broader society subverts merit at every turn. So this is a basic difference between South Asian societies and, let's say, East Asian societies. So when East Asian societies, whether they are autocratic or democratic, attempt to modernize, they can draw upon an ancient legacy, a heritage of meritocratic governance. And when the leaders of India and Pakistan attempt to modernize, they really cannot draw upon that well of experience. In fact, the historical experiences of these societies actually point us in the other direction, towards all sorts of primordialism, casteism, tribalism, sectarianism, essentially looking out for what's good for me and my kin, but not what is good for the state. So there is no public service ethos, if you will. Whatever little public service ethos we have is a kind of mock Weberian public service ethos that we borrowed from the colonial Raj. But indigenously, we don't have that public service ethos.
Right.
So fundamentally, in Pakistan,
so again in the book I was reading, and it was like fascinating to see that how the rulers and I forgot exactly which one you were referring to there, but there was an exam where the people were graded on different things, और जिस चीज़ में वो लोग अच्छे थे उनको उस चीज़ में they would get the jobs and they would have the salaries. So in a way there was a more systemized or more systematic process back then, and which knowledge probably you lost in the middle. Is that so?
Uh, what the Arthashastra basically says about this is that the ruler should appoint people based upon their qualities. So somebody who is good at something should be appointed to something that they are presumably going to be good at. But the discretion is essentially left with the ruler. So the ruler gets to decide what is merit and what isn't merit. Whereas at around the same time in China, there was a big intellectual revolution that took place where, in essence, it was agreed that merit is to be determined by your academic learning and competence. And there needs to be some sort of test, not controlled by the ruler, to determine who is actually competent and who isn't competent. So, in our context, when we think of merit, it exists as a kind of mirror for princes, that a wise ruler should pick wise people to assist that ruler. But there is no institutional process at play. It is basically the wisdom of the ruler that will then determine the wisdom of the people he chooses. So, if you luck out, as we have in our history periodically, and you end up with a Chandragupta Maurya or an Akbar, then they will pick wise people to help them. But the problem is that these rulers are the exception. Most of your rulers are actually quite degenerate. They are closer to Muhammad Shah Rangila than Akbar. So the result is that this kind of arbitrary behavior, where the ruler decides what is merit and what isn't merit, it only works for the duration of a competent ruler's reign. It does not actually transcend that. So there is a difference in the way in which that was organized.
So, in a way, that does not strengthen the institutions, but for the time being, like whatever arrangement they may come up with, it would promote the culture of power in a way.
Yeah.
So that's
a wise
deeply,
ruler,
deeply rooted in our blood,
exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And do you see that these practices somehow reflect in our practices today, and which is why we also look for those messiah, the leaders who single-handedly would change the system, so we would bet on them rather than trying to fix the institutions?
When you look at governments in South Asia or also West Asia, what you see is that there is a very powerful myth that is a part of our culture. And that myth is that the Sultan is a good man. He is benevolent. He means well. But he has been led astray by his vizier or by the people around him. So if somehow the Sultan realizes that he is surrounded by bad people, he will replace them with good people. And from the goodness of those new people, the state will benefit and there will be peace and order and justice and other such things. This benevolence myth is a very, very powerful part of our culture. And it is something which political leaders also cash in on. So that is to say, people support somebody not because they do well, but because they believe they have the intention of doing well.
Mm-hmm.
So in our part of the world, this is something which the rulers often benefit from, often unconsciously, because that is the expectation of the society at large, that, oh, if only the ruler realizes. So we have to be a little bit careful in this respect that societies, well, every society is vulnerable to a messiah-like figure or popular figure, a charismatic figure. But societies like ours are maybe more vulnerable to seeing politics and political and administrative processes as being a function of personality rather than structure. and believing that all you need is people with good personality and everything will fall in line. Whereas what history teaches us, what social sciences teaches us is that structure fundamentally modifies behavior. And when you take a good person and you put them in a bad structure, in an arbitrary situation, in a situation where they have arbitrary power, it is only a matter of time before that experience corrodes whatever moral or psychological inhibitions they may have had.
So they become part of the system.
They become part of the system. And this can often happen even unconsciously. So it typically happen all at once. It typically happens through a series of small compromises. And then those smaller compromises lead to bigger compromises. And then you are basically conditioned to accept that this is how the business of government is to be conducted.
And do you think like that this is precisely the case in a bureaucratic structure in Pakistan?
I would say that in many ways, Pakistan's bureaucracy has largely lost any kind of idealism about its role in the state. It has lost any kind of ethos towards genuine public service, towards resisting arbitrary decisions made by the whoever happens to be politically in charge at any point in time, and is presently in a very, very unfortunate state. Because if Pakistan is to improve, it has to have a better quality of public servant. There is no way that the quality of your governance can be better than the quality of your public officials. But the quality of your public officials is not just a question of them having cleared 30 years ago one exam. It is a question of their conditioning after they have taken that exam as well. So even if you start with a meritocracy in terms of recruitment to the public service, you very quickly degenerate that into something which is not at all meritocratic as people move up the chain. So you end up with a kind of pseudo-meritocracy where the people moving up the chain perhaps feel that we are very merit-based, but in fact, in many of the cases, their rise is occasioned not by their ability to be good public officials or to be law-abiding public officials, but simply by their ability to please whoever happens to be the boss at any given point in time.
So that's a very important thing. So like the system encourages people who not necessarily outperform the others, but there is a particular sort of like corruption in a way involved into this process, that the system does not allow an outperforming individual to be rewarded efficiently.
Because there's no use for such an individual. You see, if you are let's say, a young assistant commissioner or you're a young assistant superintendent of police and you're posted to the district, and the demand is to help rig an election, or the demand is to engage in political victimization of whoever happens to be out of favor at that point in time, the correct thing to do is to refuse and to accept a suspension. How many civil servants actually do that? So I remember once I had given my students an essay assignment. This is like a long time ago, before ChatGPT destroyed all essays. And I asked them that, well, decide what type of career do you want to pursue, and give one rational reason and one moral reason for your choice of career or job or whatever. So a lot of the kids said that, we want to attempt the CSS or the differential exams and go into the bureaucracy. A few were more specific and said that, we'd really like to go into the police or the DMG or something like that. And I'll never forget that several of them essentially wrote the same thing, but in different ways. The rational reason for going into the bureaucracy they gave was that, well, we see that bureaucrats have a very good lifestyle and they are living very lavishly and they are enjoying lots of perks and privileges. And we would want that for ourselves. So that is our rational reason. And the moral reason is that if we are in the bureaucracy, we are then in a position to help our family members and our other people with their various things that they need to get done from the government. So the rational reason is that we're going to get rich and through public service. And the moral reason is that we can essentially engage in nepotism once we have been recruited through the competitive exams in order to serve the public. So what that basically, again, shows you is the kind of mirror from the society at large. And when you allow this kind of thinking to proliferate, then it becomes very easy to engage in all sorts of compromises. Because then basically the law is just what suits the ruler at any given point in time. Merit is whatever the ruler likes at any given point in time. A good official is somebody who always says, yes, boss, who never points out when a project is cracked or when a project is stupid or when a project is against the public interest, and who essentially tries to do whatever the ruler likes as quickly as possible. So when you end up with people like this at the top, then you have a situation where the entire system is then working in a way that is designed to benefit only a very few people. So that then creates another path dependency, that when junior people come into the system and they look at their seniors, the role models they see are all bad, or let's say 80% bad. And so they very quickly realize in that structure that if we want to become an outstanding official at the top of their game, then we have to, schmooze the politicians. We have to maintain a good relationship with powerful people. And we have to do as they say. And we will be rewarded for our sycophancy and our lack of spine all the way up. So the system then, like Solon's paradox, basically selects the worst people for the most important jobs. And then you and I can, of course, cry about it on a podcast because that's really all any citizen can do.
And do you think that this is also one of the reasons why we see corruption in the system? And also, like, a lot of times we see reform programs that are really good on the paper, but when it comes to the implementation, generally things fall apart and they fail. Is it like lack of accountability that, they get away with? Or what do you think? What are the core reasons for the system not to operate the way we expect it to operate?
Look, in Pakistan, accountability or corruption has essentially been used repeatedly as a political weapon. You can go back to Ayub Khan and his screening of officials for alleged corruption. You can come down to the Musharraf era and the National Accountability Bureau and his use of that instrument to penalize his political opponents. And you can come down to, the modern period, our contemporary period, near contemporary period, with the Supreme Court or the PTI, Imran Khan, PMLN, and their politics against each other. So this, of course, makes people very skeptical of any announcement that we are going to do something about corruption. The other problem, of course, is that in many ways, not just corruption, but also waste and abuse of power, which may not necessarily be people enriching themselves, but just people making bad decisions that waste a lot of public time and a lot of public money. are very much the cost of running our political system. And the reason for that is that in our political system, responsibility lies somewhere else and power lies somewhere else. So, what we see is in Pakistan since the early 1950s that in order to maintain the semblance of some kind of constitutional or civilian facade, a lot of corruption has to be tolerated as the price of maintaining that political facade. So it is something which is very much ingrained in our politics. At the same time, we also see that many other countries, both authoritarian and democratic, also wrestle with the problem of corruption. So it's not something that is unique to Pakistan, but perhaps in the Pakistani case, it is exceptionally debilitating because it is perceived to affect nearly everything.
And do you think that is the lack of capacity sometimes an excuse for resistance to change?
I think you can make all sorts of excuses, but you should make those excuses if the political leadership is actually serious about it. And what I've seen with reference to the, let's say, the record of Pakistan's successive governments from the 1950s down to the present day, is that no one has actually been serious about it. So the question of whether the problem can be tackled, capacity assumed or not assumed, is another question. The test of that would, of course, come if you have a government that genuinely goes after corrupt practices and does not go after them in the sense of, well, because he or she is my political opponent, so I am going to use various means to put them under pressure through allegations of corruption, but actually cleaning house in terms of cleaning up corruption within bureaucratic departments, within the decision-making chain, within the way in which projects are formulated and then approved by different government agencies. So that task is something which basically is often hidden from public view. But that is something which requires a lot of political will to manage. And I've never really seen that political will in any Pakistani government.
And do you think in the modern times, Abhijo, the concept of countries and borders, in a way, the countries are still managed the way empires were managed historically? So do you think like Pakistan, in a way, it's managed like an empire, which may have the rise and fall that you talked about in your book?
I think the legacy of imperial governance is very strong in our part of the world. It is very strong in other parts of the world as well. And it is something which any aspiring modern nation state has to come to terms with and has to figure out ways to first understand and then find ways to address the specific challenges that arise from that type of behavior. So before we can solve a problem, we need to have a rational diagnosis of that problem. And in that context, subjects like history or social sciences in general can be of a big help. But what one generally sees is in Pakistan is that there is very little market for any ideas or any thinking which is produced within the country. And there is a sort of almost a reflexive adoption of whatever the latest thinking is coming out of the donors or the international community or various foreign think tanks or other influential individuals. So this is also something which we have to then contend with, that ultimately, if Pakistan is to modernize, if Pakistan is to become a successful state and a successful economy and a successful society, then that means that Pakistan will become a better version of itself. It will not become Japan or Germany or America or Canada. It will become an improved version of Pakistan. And if we want an improved version of Pakistan, we need to understand why this version of Pakistan doesn't work so well for most people in it. And that is something where you need some kind of market for these ideas. But in the Pakistani context, there's a kind of crowding out of these perspectives that can, in fact, be very, very useful if anybody would be bothered in terms of listening to them. Again, assuming there is some political will to actually do something about these problems.
In Pakistan's case, there are clearly many things there where we lack and we need to improve on. And what does history tell when there is a declining nation, and where does it lead? And when we talk about like the collapse of an empire from the historical perspective, and usko agar we equate that in modern times, is it the geographical location or the boundaries of the country? Is it the nation? Or what exactly would it mean if we say that, the country may survive or not? So what comes to your mind when you think about this declining trend that we see, and where it leads us?
Okay, so typically, when you think about any empire, there are a couple of factors that you can take and use it to assess whether that empire is in decline or rising or stable or whatever. So one very important element is that empire politically stable? So this is very important, because if an empire or a state or even a nation is racked by political instability, then that obviously creates all sorts of other problems. The whole system of governance then starts to malfunction and reflect that instability. So that's the first thing, that, is there political stability? And by political stability, what I mean is the political order stable? Second thing, of course, is that does that empire possess a competitive, growing economic base? So is it producing more resources than it consumes? Or is it consuming more resources than it produces? And this includes resources that it might be getting from other countries that it has dominated, or through various other forms. But fundamentally, you look at the economic vibrancy of a particular state. So that's one very important indicator. A third very important indicator is the ideology or the sense of togetherness that exists, both in terms of within the ruling elite. Is there a strong group feeling, as Ibn Khaldun would say? And does that group feeling extend to the society at large? So that is another very important element. And then we can also point out that there are external factors, such as, for example, wars or invasions or natural disasters, that can seriously affect the fortunes of a state, even when the state itself is not responsible for them. So, you can have a very strong, successful state, but, if unfortunately you happen to be located right next to where Genghis Khan is when he begins his conquests, I mean, you really had it, no matter what your other strengths might be. Now, when we look at Pakistan, what we see is that, number one, our political order is not stable. We do not have a legitimate constitutional process for transferring authority from one government to another. And there is, as I indicated earlier, a diarchy in terms of how power is exercised, in that there is an unaccountable coterie of officials since the 1950s. that have made important decisions about the country, and the political class, as a general rule, has been the window dressing for those officials. So you have a lack of stability in your political system, and this creates all manner of distortions. Economically, since the 1980s, Pakistan has stagnated. It has experienced bouts of GDP growth that have been fairly decent. So in the 1980s, the growth was fairly decent. In the early 2000s, the growth again, 2002, 2007 was also fairly decent, like 6% or so. Not like outstanding like China's, but decent by our standards. But really, when you look at Pakistan's economic performance compared to, let's say, India or Vietnam or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, you very quickly realize that Pakistan's economy has stagnated, that we have not really developed our industrial base, we have not really developed our scientific base in a qualitative sense since the 1980s. So our economic base, though it is large in aggregate, it is very poor in quality, and Pakistanis are much poorer than, let's say, Indians are, even though they used to be somewhat richer than them if you go back 30, 40 years. So overall, the economic picture is not good in that sense. When it comes to the sense of nationalism or the sense of solidarity, on that score, Pakistan probably does decently well. So when you think about Pakistan in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there are a lot of movements which dispute the legitimacy of the state. One of those movements succeeds and forms Bangladesh, but otherwise all of them are either contained or eventually assimilated into the mainstream. So the idea of Pakistan, with all its faults and all of its problems and all of its contestation, has proven a lot more resilient than perhaps one might have imagined when the country came into existence. So externally, Pakistan has experienced shock after shock after shock since it basically came into existence. The shock of partition, the way that it was handled largely to Pakistan's disadvantage, really undermined a lot of our prospects for political stability. The secession of East Pakistan, the Indian invasion that brought it about, part of the whole Cold War sort of competition as well, that was a massive shock. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan has basically unleashed an unending war along the Pak-Afghan borderland, which keeps spilling over, sometimes greater or lesser extent, into Pakistan. So we've had a very, very rough time as an independent state. So the external shocks have kept on coming. The latest, with the war in Iran and the Middle East, you can, sort of put that in that continuum. And there is, of course, the problem that Pakistan is geographically the outer shell of South Asia. So we are really the point at which the geopolitical plates of South Asia, West Asia, and Central Asia meet. So Pakistan is situated on not just like a fault line, but essentially at the intersection of three big historical and social plates. So there are a lot of earthquakes, and we are very, very earthquake prone. So when you look at all of these factors, what one is constrained to then admit.
With earthquakes, also, I think like we're in that zone where we are also hit by the climate change the most.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Historically, climate change was not such a huge problem, but man made climate change in the current form, that's also a problem. Though, if you look at, let's say, the Indus Valley civilization, I think one of the most plausible explanations is that they experienced a very slow moving incremental climate change that they were not able to handle. But yes, you have that environmental vulnerability as well. So when you put all these things together, the environmental vulnerability, the geopolitical vulnerability, uh, political discord, economic stagnation, and you add it all up, it becomes clear that Pakistan is a state that has a lot of factors that are working against its peace, progress, cohesion, stability. Some of those are self inflicted. Regrettably, we're not willing to do anything about the self inflicted wounds. Some of those are externally inflicted. We have from time to time been able to manipulate those and get some additional benefits for ourselves, some windfalls from time to time. But typically, we then squander that windfall on our own innate non seriousness when it comes to addressing our country's problems. So you have that very, very serious problem for us.
So, do you think that the country will continue operating the way it is operating, or could there be any particular reform that can change the direction of where we are heading to?
Well, I'm basically of the view that all the problems that we often talk about and occupy, most of the oxygen, such as, politics or economic underperformance or what is happening on the world stage and geopolitical shocks and stuff like that. These are all very important things. But I think that Pakistan has demonstrated that it can survive these things. What Pakistan cannot survive is what climate change is going to do to the Indus Basin. So, if we are to look at all of these problems, some of them are very serious, some of them inflict huge losses on Pakistan, material losses and human losses, but they are not of a sufficient scale to actually imperil the existence of Pakistan. Climate change does imperil that existence. And in the Pakistani context, we are exceptionally vulnerable to it. But what we see is that there is very little thinking on how do we deal with this problem. So what I basically go around advocating is that if Pakistan is to survive climate change, you need a national survival strategy. You need a kind of NCOC type model put in place. You need an environmental emergency to be declared. And you then need to rely upon experts with the support of the military and the bureaucracy to then go and do whatever is necessary in the next 10, 15 years that we have left to actually prepare ourselves for what is coming.
Mm.
So that is something which I think does actually imperil Pakistan, because Pakistan is the Indus state. No Indus, no state. So we have to adapt to that if we want to survive into the longer run. The other problems are very serious, and one should not, be dismissive towards them. But as I indicated, they are not problems which I think will actually cause Pakistan to cease to exist or collapse, or in that sense. I really wish we do a lot better on the economic front or on the political front, etc. But we're not going to fall apart because of those things.
And this dispute with India on Indus Water Treaty, do you think that Pakistan and India are going to have a second round of conflict?
I think the first thing is that the Indians themselves refer to it as a pause. So we don't know whether Pakistan will hit play or they will hit play first. But another round, I think, is inevitable or nearly inevitable.
Okay.
What would actually trigger that round is open to question. It could be, let's say, another major attack in India against a civilian or military target, which the Indians then pin on Pakistan and say that, well, we're going to do or resume rather Operation Sindoor. From the Pakistani side, the Indus and India's attempts to effectively walk out of the treaty and to then build infrastructure that could potentially allow India to permanently or substantially alter the flow of water into Pakistan is, of course, something which is far more serious than like a one-off military operation, tit-for-tat type response, which we had last year in May. That is something which would then require Pakistan to basically destroy the offending infrastructure. And if Pakistan does that, the Indian reaction to it is likely to be very, very severe and could well push the region into an all-out war. So I think that is something where you could actually have a very serious conflict between India and Pakistan. And not on a limited scale, but and the problem is that once that happens and you have two nuclear powers involved, it's really there is no manual for open-ended conventional war between two nuclear powers. This is something which nobody has thought about as to how to manage it. Because the whole point of having nuclear weapons is that you do not then fight an all-out conventional war for the risk of using those nuclear weapons.
And historically, there isn't any precedent of any such escalation.
There really isn't. I mean, there have been minor clashes between nuclear powers. So in, I think, 1969, there were clashes on the border between the Soviets and the Chinese. Though China did not have that much of a nuclear arsenal at the time, they still had some. The Kargil conflict is another example. Though again, when that conflict took place, neither India nor Pakistan had large nuclear arsenals. Now between the two of them, they're estimated to have close to 400 nuclear warheads. So really, there hasn't been this kind of a direct clash at scale between nuclear powers.
Where do you think that Iran, USA, Israel conflict that is heading to?
I think that we should be ready for a prolonged period of instability in the region. I think that the objectives for which the Iranians are fighting and the Americans started the war are not objectives that really can be achieved through a short conflict. So you're likely to see a prolongation of the conflict with maybe some attempts by both sides to try and keep the conflict contained within a certain band. And alongside that, you're likely to see talks continuing at a technical level or maybe even at a higher political level from time to time. But this is going to be a process that will now play out.
So this peace talk ka jo process tha, do you think that this will go on for years and years probably if the conflict continues?
Well, I mean, peace talks can continue for years while there is fighting going on for years as well. So let's say when you look at talks between Vietnam and the United States, those talks took place over several years. So, if you think about, let's say, the proximity talks that ended the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, those also lasted for several years. So, while you are talking, you are also fighting. And sometimes you're basically talking and not really fighting, you're taking a break. And, this is maybe something which people don't realize about wars, that actually wars often have a lot of inactivity. So let's say when you think about, let's say, the First World War or even the Second World War, there are pauses. There are periods during which everybody is resupplying, restocking, recuperating, reorganizing, and preparing for the next round of actually intense kinetic fighting. So that could be the situation that we are now looking at in this war between the Iranians and the United States and its allies.
Do you think that we are already going through World War III?
I think what we are seeing is that there is now effectively an open-ended war of attrition raging in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. There is now another potentially open-ended war in the Middle East between Iran and the United States and Israel. If during this time, before either of these conflicts are resolved, let's say China decides to move on Taiwan, then you may well say that we are in a world war. But right now, I would say we are not yet in a world war, but we are far closer to a world war than any sane person would like to be.
Because, like you mentioned, that there would be phases where the war intensifies and whatnot. So, like maybe people during the World War II may not initially have the idea that they are actually well inside a world war. So
that's it.
We might be going through a phase as well.
So, for example, when you look at the opening campaign of World War II, that was the German invasion of Poland.
Yeah.
After the Germans conquered Poland, they then moved their forces around. It took them a good 6 months. And during those 6 months, there was no major fighting. Then in May 1940, they began their invasion of Western Europe, leading to the defeat of France. So again, even within a world war, you can actually have periods of relative calm, and then the storm kicks up again. So that might be the kind of situation we're now facing in the West Asian region as well.
And with the conflict of India, Pakistan, especially, I think like that would also trigger a lot of global conflict.
Oh, definitely. There's a very good report by the paper by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, in which they calculate that in India-Pakistan nuclear war, and these calculations are several years old, now they would be a lot more dire, would not only destroy India and Pakistan as functioning states, but they would kick up enough atmospheric cloud and atmospheric dust, that it would cause a 10 to 40% reduction in sunlight. And that would lead to crop failures and the deaths of between 1 and 2 billion people outside of South Asia just from famine.
I was reading somewhere that probably to kill all humanity on the globe, we need 100 arsenals. And between India and Pakistan, we share like 400?
No, the Indian and Pakistani nuclear weapons are not as powerful as, let's say, the Soviet and American ones.
Okay.
But one of the things to understand is that when you use a nuclear weapon, there is the actual blast itself and the radiation, which produces the carnage at the center of the blast and around the blast.
Sure.
But the most lethal part for the rest of the planet is the dust that it kicks up.
Right. And that can take several years to fail the entire ecosystem.
Exactly. So if you use, let's say, 350 nuclear weapons within a period of a few days in South Asia, then you are, of course, going to kill tens of millions of people in the nuclear exchange. But the atmospheric dust that it kicks up, that is actually going to kill far, far more people through famine than the nuclear exchange itself is going to kill. So, that effect of nuclear weapons, the nuclear winter, if you will, even a mild nuclear winter, would devastate global agriculture. So, so with India and Pakistan, the thing is that the world could suddenly find itself in a global crisis because the Indians and the Pakistanis got themselves into an escalation trap, and neither side was willing to back down. And the result was an explosive, uncontrolled escalation in which one or the other started making moves that was interpreted as a nuclear move, triggering the other party to start using their nuclear weapons. So, I mean, that would, of course, be a nightmarish scenario, but which is why it's so important for the rest of the world that India and Pakistan resolve their differences without fighting and through negotiations. But the Indians don't seem to be interested in that at all.
Do you think that they're probably like living in a delusion somehow, because they would know the consequences as well, and so it's not like the damage would be equally devastating, right?
I think the Indian leadership thinks that they can present Pakistan with a fait accompli on the Indus Waters Treaty, that there is not going to be any serious international pushback against India, even if it completely rubbishes the treaty, that Pakistan does not have the global diplomatic or geopolitical clout to impose any significant costs on India, and that once they have imposed this fait accompli, the Pakistanis will have to decide between dying quickly or dying slowly. And given a choice, they'll probably choose to die slowly. So maybe that is what they are thinking.
That would be such a doomsday scenario.
Well, or 5 years from now,
Yeah.
the way things are going.
The other doomsday scenario that seemed to be building up slowly as well feels to be the rise of AI and robotics. From historical perspective, where do you think that we are heading to?
Well, I think it's important to understand what are the really dangerous uses of AI and what are the uses of AI that are going to, let's say, harm us in some ways, but not necessarily, kill us or hurt us all that greatly. So, when it comes to the really bad things that appear to be happening with AI, is the fact that the world's militaries are increasingly integrating AI into their decision-making chains, into their information processing, which effectively cuts down the reaction time and removes the element of human input and control from the information or the perception forming process. So that is extremely dangerous. And because the United States has gone ahead and done it with sentient, other countries who have the ability are also going to do it.
Yeah.
So that is something which is very, very bad. I mean, that is like, Skynet and Terminator type bad. I mean, you should really not be doing this, but that is what people are doing. The other thing, of course, is that AI appears to be extremely thirsty for water. And what we are seeing is that people who have big investments in AI and AI infrastructure really seem to be more concerned about ensuring an adequate supply of water for their AI than for the rest of humanity.
So that's like due to the large data centers that they have to maintain.
The extremely large data centers that they have to maintain. So that's another very, very serious problem. The third very serious problem is the way in which AI allows for capital to be concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and for that concentration to produce political effects that can be very destabilizing or dangerous for societies. So, with AI, you have like these very, very serious challenges that need to be addressed. Other problems related to AI are like, for example, there's a debate about whether AI can be conscious or not. So I fall into the camp which basically argues that if it mimics consciousness, then for all practical intents and purposes, it is conscious. Even if it is not conscious like you and I are conscious, it is still mimicking consciousness. So that's good enough for it to be conscious.
If you cannot tell the difference between whether if it's conscious or not, and if it is out of your control, then it doesn't matter.
Then that's a very interesting academic debate which we can have, but it maybe doesn't make that much difference to the actual way in which it is thinking. The other thing, of course, is that AI has had a huge impact on education. The loss.
And do you think that that is resulting in intellectual decay somehow?
What I've basically seen is that it's created a situation where the professors are reading off slides prepared by AI, and the students are using the AI to effectively generate assignments to pass or get good grades on their classes. So it really is a problem on both sides.
Also, so the professors may also be using AI for the grading purposes or assessment purposes.
And they could be using it for that as well. And they can be using it to generate the content as well.
So it's more like that the AI is, operating on both sides. So the content is produced by AI and it is assessed by AI.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's on both sides effectively. Then what is the point of the professor and what is the point of the student really? So that has very grave implications for higher education and education in general. You do see, of course, that now governments are banning laptops. They're banning social media. They're banning various things at certain levels. Certain universities are also moving to ban laptop use and other such things. But this is a very interesting problem because when you do an assignment yourself, when you write yourself, when you think yourself, when you speak for yourself, you are engaging in an exercise that is building your intellectual capacity. When you simply ask the AI, what is the answer to this, or write me an assignment for this, or write me a review of this book, or whatever, what you're doing is that you are foregoing your own intellectual growth and engagement with whatever that exercise or text is. So that is, I think, a grave disservice to anyone, that you're effectively allowing everybody to cheat. And if everybody cheats, that means nobody is really learning.
Yeah.
And that is not good, because what distinguishes us as a species is our ability to learn, is to figure things out. So we have to be careful in terms of where to use AI and where not to use AI. So there are some areas where probably you can use it very well, and there are maybe other areas where its use should be restricted or maybe even banned altogether. So that is a very interesting regulatory question for any higher education or education sector.
And its broader impact on the society, the employability. Do you feel, what's your AI prediction for 20 years, 25 years from now?
I think the way in which it will evolve over 20, 25 years will be exponential, uh, extremely disruptive, and in many ways not really possible to predict sitting in our time,
Yeah.
because that curve of improvement is going to be very, very steep. So we really can't say where it will end up. What we can say is that even in its current relatively simple state, it is creating a lot of challenges for how we think and learn and act. And the uses that it is being put to, whether it is in warfare or whether it is in economics or whether it is in its consumption of resources, all point to a situation where the more powerful AI becomes, the more dangerous it will become, and the harder it will become for any human operator to be able to effectively control or understand it.
Considering Pakistani society, where we stand at the moment, our fragile systems, intellectual decay, or all the problems that we see in the society today, do you think that we are ready for any exponential change such as this AI is going to bring about, and how we are going to survive that?
I think, generally speaking, Pakistanis are pretty good when it comes to any kind of technical adaptation that can help them. And our government and our organized sectors are generally very bad at leveraging these changes in such a way that you can benefit the state or the society as a whole. So with AI, one of the, let's say, good things that you can think about it is that it can not only translate everything into different languages, but it can even read it out for you. So it actually allows a society like ours, where you do not have a very well developed educational base, where literacy and numeracy are still challenges, to kind of circumvent some of the bottlenecks that we face.
Mhm.
But at the same time, if let's say you start building AI data centers in Pakistan, where are we going to get the water from? Already we are so badly stressed. If we start integrating AI into warfare, then what's going to happen when the next India-Pakistan crisis rolls around? So we also have to be very, very thoughtful, I'd say, in our adaptation of these things.
That's interesting. I mean, I never thought about it this way, that, in a warfare, you cannot entirely depend on AI, which is developed by another country, because then you're heavily dependent on them providing you that full access to the technology.
Huh? You're fighting a war and you get an update that your, subscription has expired. And then you're like waiting to renew the subscription. So that's probably not a lot of fun.
Probably, which is why, like, now it makes sense that I know for a fact that Punjab government has also recently started some initiatives around AI. There is some work going on as well. I'm not sure if we are going to develop our own AI, and like you mentioned, the amount of energy, expertise, everything that is required to make it happen, if we even have those But yeah, that is going to play a big role probably in the warfare in coming future.
That certainly will.
Before we conclude, I have one question to ask: that what's the best advice that you have ever received?
Well, the best advice that I have ever received is that whenever you're faced with a problem, whatever that problem is, uh, you should be willing to try and solve it. But if you can't, or if it's beyond your control, don't take it too personally, because there'll be plenty of more problems and plenty of more failures that you will experience as well in your life. So I think that's very important. That, very often we teach everybody how to celebrate success and be successful and be, award winner, be this winner, number one, etc. But I think it's also just as important to teach people that it's okay to mess up. It's okay not to be able to get a good result, uh, especially if you have tried your best to get one.
So don't get sunk into the failure in a way. Move on. Life should
Move
move
on to
on.
your
Yeah.
next failure, basically.
Next. Yeah.
I think there's a
Yeah.
Churchill quote to that effect, that success is moving from one failure to the next without loss of enthusiasm. So maybe that's the advice.
Dr. Ilhan, thank you so much for your time. It was lovely talking to you,
My pleasure. My
and
pleasure.
I hope to see you soon again.
See you soon. Take care.